Hey everybody, it's Dave Coplin here, bringing you another Rise of the Human special, dialing into the future of work. This week we have David Price, the author of this fabulous book, The Power of Us, which, having read it, I think is essentially the closest thing you're going to find to a handbook, a guidebook, if you will, that will help you navigate the chaos and ambiguity that lies ahead. I'm pleased to say we've got David with us right now in the studio. So David, welcome to the show and thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you, Dave, and thanks for having such a kind of well-referenced copy of the book. I love it when I see little post-it notes stuck out.
Do you know what? It's a really recent thing for me. My wife was looking at me a couple of days ago as I was doing this, and she was like, who are you and what have you done with my husband? Because before, books were kind of like religious texts to me and you didn't mark them, you respected them. As I've got a bit older, I'd rather read and engage the book and get well into it rather than just leave it out. So it's now my hallmark is actually to, and even red pen. I mean, not that I'm correcting spelling mistakes, but I'm trying to find the bits that I want to get to quickly later in the day. So look, with that in mind, I'd love to know about the origins of the book. And in particularly, I also want to know, what's it like to be one of the oldest hipsters in Austin?
Well, the two things are connected. So I guess my first book was called Open, How We'll Work, Live and Learn in the Future. And, I used to be a musician and I thought, oh, God, this is second album syndrome. That idea that you've said everything you needed to say in that first album or the first book. And so it took much longer than I expected it to do, but gradually a bunch of ideas started to form, and I was starting to look at what I was seeing around the world, because I was going around, lots of different countries and giving talks, and of course seeing the huge changes that politically and socially which had taken place over the last 5 years. And at some point I thought, I'm going to have to try and test these ideas out and see if it's just me. And I've been asked to speak at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, which is just one of my favorite places. Have you been, Dave?
No, I've never been lucky enough to go, actually.
Oh, it's great. It is the last, in some ways, it's kind of very hippie-ish. And in other ways, it's absolutely cutting edge. And for those people who might be watching this who aren't familiar with South by Southwest, it's a kind of Edinburgh festival in terms of its size, but it's about new ideas, new tech, new films. It is just a hipster's retreat, and they booked me into a room that held about 500 people, and I think I'd done a title like "Say Hello to Your New Best Friend: People Powered Innovation," and that was kind of it. And about 3 minutes before I was due to go on, I said to my wife, "There's nobody here. No one is going to turn up." And I said, "Listen, if 10 people turn up, I will turn this into a book." And out of nowhere, 500 people just descended on the place. I guess it is like Edinburgh in that sense. They're constantly moving around, and suddenly they all arrived. And I said the same thing to them. I said, "Listen, I just want to try these ideas out. If it resonates at all, stick around afterwards and we'll talk." And about 120 people stuck around, and we had a great conversation. And people were kind of saying, "Yeah, I think you're onto something there." And then, of course, that's when the real work started, because I thought I need some case studies. I need to get, the frame of the book sorted out. And I thought I had that so that was 3 years ago when I went to South by Southwest. In February of this year, I kind of got what I thought was the final draft finished. I was in Australia at the time. And then, of course, COVID happened and I had a publication date, but I also had a publisher who was just saying to me, you have to include this. You really have to include it. And I thought, yes, she's right, I do. So I kind of rewrote the whole thing over 3 weeks in March to April.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because I mean I was going to say I had the same as you. I didn't have the same as you because I've been procrastinating writing a book for about 3 years, and when COVID hit, it really floored me because I thought, oh my God, because the book is no longer relevant, and I would have been, had I written it, I would have been ripping it up. What was that like? Was it like a mountain of work? Were you lucky in the sense that actually a lot of the stuff you'd written about was still relevant? How did that process happen?
Yeah, well, I thought, here's an acid test of what I'm saying, because what I could see, if you remember those first few weeks of lockdown in the UK, it was just crazy. 1,000 Facebook self-help groups sprung up overnight. things like scrub hubs making PPE when the British government failed to deliver any. And so I thought I'll take the case study organisations that I've looked at, and if they haven't pivoted at all, if they've done nothing different in the face of this pandemic, then there's a problem. But they all had, and one of my case studies was Brewdog, and they were almost out of business, and they switched overnight from distilling gin to making hand sanitizers. Their delivery vans stopped delivering beer and started delivering meals to sheltered and vulnerable people, and so on. Almost all of those case study organizations had shifted in the light of COVID. So on the one hand, it was a ton of work, but on the other hand, it was the book that I just felt this is never going to end, because something would happen every day. And one day my editor rang up and said, have you seen the news? And I said, no, what? And she said, there's a guy called George Floyd being murdered. You have to include it. And I thought, yeah, I do. But at what point do you say, that's it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's got to be super tough. What I really liked, though, is, I liked a number of things, David, but in sort of, as you're laying out the case for why the book is relevant now, and also why COVID accentuates the need, you talked about these sort of 6 emergent trends that would really brought us to this point. And you also make the point, and actually, certainly from my perspective, I'm absolutely inclined to agree with you that so much of what we're going through now was happening anyway. It's just that the virus has made it far more significant or happen more quickly. But those 6 trends you were talking about were things like a crisis of identity, a sense of learned helplessness, the return of the artisan, the opening of knowledge, the dawn of scalable learning, and the quest for self-determination. This isn't a test, by the way, but I'd love it if you could just sort of walk us through some of those trends and some of the ideas behind the thinking, because I think it really lays out the context of where we're then going to go, which is really about what we can do with some of those things.
I would absolutely love to, Dave, because you are the only person so far in all of the interviews that I've given who's actually highlighted that chapter. And for me, it was kind of fundamental to it, because you have to see how we got to where we are.
Totally.
So thank you for raising that question. So crisis of identity, I think, as you say, this was already happening. We've had a society whereby you're judged by the work that you do, the job title that you have. When we talk to kids, we say, what do you want to be when you grow up? You go to a dinner party, you say, what do you do? And suddenly with artificial intelligence and automation, that's no longer the case. We have to face up to the fact that not everyone is going to be able to find a job. And so being defined by the work that we do seems to be wrong. It just doesn't seem to fit for the life that's coming up. Equally, though, one of those other trends that I noticed, which has really accelerated during COVID, is what I call the rise of the artisan. And I wasn't the first one to talk about this. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, talked about the coming artisanal economy. But we were seeing a rise in craft breweries. We're seeing everybody was making sourdough bread during lockdown. And just yesterday, I was listening to a Radio 4 program where they had a series of people who've lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic and have shifted to trying to make a living out of their hobbies. And one woman was selling cupcakes, another one was putting kits together for pottery. So there is this sense, I think, now that going forward, we should be identifying ourselves by what we can create, what we make, which may or may not lead to, a financial reward. But that's why I like the use of that word occupation now, because it's what we are occupied by. And for many people, that's going to be different things. But it's a way of labeling yourself, which I think is less damning in the current scenario than simply your rank within an organization.
Yeah, no, totally. And look, excuse me, there's a big conversation I'd love to have with you. And we'll get to part of it today, but it is about how do we appropriately equip people for the future that they're going to inherit, specifically kids, but also us as well. But so those trends kind of set the scene. And there were just some other points of context that I thought were also really curious to me about why you would do it. One of them was you seem to be quite keen to make a distinction between users and customers and consumers. So users being really the focal point of the people who are at the heart of this. Where I come from, and this won't be a surprise to you, that there's only two types of people that talk about users, and it's drug dealers and computer programmers. And so I was quite interested on your perspective on why sort of this concept of being a user or being the focal point needed to be framed in that way.
Yeah, well, I think it is that shift, and this for me was the. It goes back to that South by Southwest presentation that I gave, because I said I felt like they'd been an overlooked group, and that's we have to get away from this notion of we produce stuff and then we find a market for it and we find people who are going to consume it, because the world just doesn't work like that anymore. And I started coming across all these crazy groups who were taking existing products and then hacking them, like IKEA hackers who will take IKEA furniture and then will throw that leaflet away and they'll make of it what they will, take a photograph of it and put it up. And IKEA's response to that, I think, went right to the heart of the dilemma and the need for a paradigm shift. Because initially they sent them a cease and desist letter and they said, you've got to stop doing this. And so all those, and by this time there's hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and they just said, okay, fine. We can hack anybody's furniture. We'll just buy someone else's. Is that what you want us to do? And IKEA, to their credit, said, okay. Yeah, what if we give you a part of our website? And then now they're actually starting to develop their first range of hackable furniture. I think we have to accept now that we've always had users. And before the Industrial Revolution, pretty much everything was as a result of user innovation, whether it was the farmer, making changes to the plow. But because of industrialization, we came to see the world in two very distinct groups. There are the producers, and then there are people who use that product or service that you produce. What I think I'm trying to say in the book is that those users also innovated, and 54% of all new inventions still today come from users themselves. So what do we want to do with that knowledge? Do we want to compete with them? Are we going to try to ignore that? Or, as in the case of my book, some of these organizations have said, work with us, let's co-create something together. And that to me seems to be the sensible, if not the only, response to this.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's very clear. It's funny, I've been having a conversation with my son, who's a teenager, about this. One of his favorite brands is Nintendo, and they're kind of where IKEA was in the first place, very closed to anybody wanting to create stuff on top of their platform. Whereas Sega, their old rival, but equally, did not do as well as Nintendo, actively welcome people in. And he's describing how much he wants to be part of the Sega community because he feels that he can innovate with them. And innovation, actually, I wanted to come to as well, because you had a really nice point about sort of innovation and established institutions, which you've laid out in the IKEA example. And certainly, pre-pandemic, I think there were a lot of organizations in IKEA's place which would be, this is all noise and we can't do it like this. But I think the pandemic has forced them to become, has disrupted them in many ways and forced them to become innovative. Do you think that as a result of the pandemic, those institutions, those old-fashioned sort of very stable organizations will become more innovative as a result of their experience in the pandemic?
Well, I think if they're not, then they won't be around for much longer. And I think they've also got to recognize that, you building a community of users rather than just growing a customer base is what it's about now. And it isn't. There are lots and lots of examples, and I put some in the book, of what I call strategic openness. So you give the appearance that you're asking for someone's opinion. I remember Starbucks once did a thing where they said, "Give us your ideas for recipes," but it was so kind of constrained and restricted. Whereas BrewDog, the craft brewery up in Scotland, they kind of just open their doors once a year and say, "Come on, brew something. We're not going to tell you what to do, and if it works, we'll have a relationship over that." And Procter and Gamble have been doing this for years with Connect and Develop, and it has completely transformed that organization. And in a way, they were the canary in the coal mine, because there was an organization 10 years ago with the R&D staff of 9,000 people around the world, and they still couldn't keep up with the need for innovation. And it was
Yeah.
when they looked outside of the organization and said, if you've got an idea, bring it in and let's work together. So that now I think it's 40% of all new products come from outside of the organization. So
Wow.
if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for other people.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it makes me think of, there's another part, a bit later on in the book, you're talking about values and attributes for organizations, which I think is related to the point you've just made, but it talks about things about fostering communities rather than competition, staying true to your roots, finding your tribe, and don't try to fake it. I mean, I certainly feel that in the Brewdog case study that you lay out, and you can see it in Procter & Gamble. Do you think that's the sort of the organizational culture for the future, is the organizations that really allow people to come in? I mean, it makes me think of, we haven't had this conversation, but I spent 12 years at Microsoft, but at a point where Microsoft transitioned from that very sort of closed door, we're not interested in open source software and all that sort of stuff, we do it best, you can, to actually now being the best platform on which to write and host open source software. And it was wonderful to see that transition, because I think they've done better as a result of it. But do you think these sort of four attributes and sort of principles are the things that will drive the most successful organizations forward?
I think so, because values really matter to millennials, and I remember 6 years ago, I interviewed a guy called Rusty Miller in Australia. He's a surfing legend. He's in his 70s, and he was bemoaning then the way surfer culture had been changed by the kind of companies like Billabong and Quicksilver, who'd taken what was essentially a very kind of almost traditional community where experience and respect for elders was valued. And then they turned it into something which was all about stunts and lifestyle. And Rusty really kind of foresaw what was going to happen, because Billabong, even though it was started by users, it was a couple of guys who were surfers themselves, but once they became producers and that user mentality got squeezed out, then it seems to me that they lost the trust of their original community that they'd come from. And it is so easy to do. And people can spot it a mile off. You know, if you remember MySpace for musicians, as soon as Rupert Murdoch bought it, they just went, bye, see ya, we'll go somewhere else. And so understanding that, to me, seems to be absolutely key, because most people have made that, transition from being a user to a producer. And I think what Brewdog are trying to do is to say, yes, we are big now. We're a big craft brewery, but we still believe in making people passionate about craft beer. And so we'll work with small independent breweries, and we'll work with, people who are just fans of home brew.
Yeah, it's tough though. And it's funny because there is some sort of commonalities in the Brewdog story. And I know there's a whole punk ethos in Brewdog, but I will... I'm a big sort of fan of The Clash, and so you sort of read their story, and the story was, they wanted to rebel against the establishment. They were part of the punk movement, but sort of at the peak of their career, they finally realized that in order to be at the peak of their career, they had to completely, not apply to any of the principles that got them to be at the peak of their career. So you can't be punk when you're selling millions of records, was their sort of theory. And then they started to play, in the back of pubs in Leeds, in the car park, and all that sort of stuff from these massive stadium gigs. Do you think that's an inevitability for companies like Brewdog? Do you think you can reach a point of success and scale where that whole punk ethos, that sort of, I don't know, openness, the transparency just becomes a bit like unsustainable?
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see, because, people are speculating as to when they'll do an IPO. And once they've done that, you haven't got as much control over the company as possible. I've met James Watt, the founder, and he's the least kind of like a punk temperamentally, and I speak as a musician who lost his job during the whole punk era. So I for years, I had this resentment about punks. Well, they can't really play it. So people like me come on, and then now I find myself, really valuing that DIY culture. I honestly, my own belief is that it's been a useful marketing strategy for them to appear to be the rebels. But there comes a point when you're as big as they are now, where I think you should just let it go, let that whole punk thing go.
Yeah, no, interesting. And so it's good that you should talk about James Watt, because I wanted to talk about leaders and leadership now. And in the book, you talk about a very specific style of leadership. You talk about this thing, the architectural leader, and you also lay out a whole series of other styles of leaders, from surgeons to soldiers, accountants, philosophers, and architects. I'm really keen to understand what is an architectural leader and what makes it distinct from those other styles of leadership.
Well, this was a fascinating study which was carried out and published by the Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago. And it was actually a study based in leadership of schools. And so they looked at typically the schools in the UK and the way in which the various leadership styles manifested themselves. And they identified these 5, and I won't go through all 5. But what they found was that the surgeons, who were, people who would come into a school and turn it around, it was having poor results, but suddenly they were getting good results. They would fire people, they would bring in new blood, and 3 years later they would move on, and then the results would just plummet again. They were the ones who typically get well paid, well rewarded. And I looked at that, and then I looked at some of the organizations, commercial organizations that I'd worked with. So, well, yeah, I can spot exactly who they are. The only ones who really led to a sustainable change were people that they termed the architects. And what architects do is they go in and they kind of recognize that they're not going to suddenly turn around the organization. They're going to build a sense of community. They're going to look outside of the organization, and they're going to go for incremental growth, slowly but over time. And the interesting thing about the architects is when they leave those organizations, the improvement tends to continue. And there was no better example of the architect leader that I met than Gary Ridge, who's the CEO and chair of WD-40 company, because he has built what he calls a tribe in that organization, and it has transformed it, but incrementally over time. And he's done so in a way which, he keeps a doll on a sofa in his office that he calls Al, the soul-sucking CEO. And I said, why do you keep that doll there, Gary? And he said, it's there to remind me that, when ego eats empathy, then I'm getting it wrong. And he said, Al stands for the very characteristics that I never want to associate myself with. And I do think we are seeing this shift. Simon Sinek's writing about servant leadership. But I also think, and James Watt is a really good example of this, that we're seeing leaders who are really curious and they believe in learning for the organization, and they model that learning themselves. James takes about 30 odd books when he goes away on holiday, and he's going to get a ton of ideas. He's extremely well read. And it's the same with Gary. He put himself through a master's and is now encouraging other people to do it. So it seems to me it isn't just about the servant leader, it's the leader as lead learner, which is typifying this shift that we're seeing.
Yeah, I really like that. Before we go there, though, there was a brilliant subhead, one of many that made me smile in the book, and one of them was to gain control, lose control, which to me is kind of at the heart of the leadership change that has to take place as we transition from these old sort of the industrial economy through to the digital knowledge economy. What do you mean about that? Is this sort of sense that leaders need to take a step back and empower people in order to succeed? Is that where you were going with that?
Absolutely, but I think they also have to recognize that you can't do that piecemeal. It's best explained through a consultation I was asked to come in. So it was a leader of what was actually an educational business, a chain of schools in Australia. And she said, I need my people to be more innovative. I'm sure you've had the same kind of, request where you come in and they just want you to sprinkle a bit of fairy dust on them. These people were highly innovative, but there was a sense of them being held down, and that everything every new idea had to go through this leader. And at the end of the day, I sat down with her and I said, okay, let's think about what we could do. What about if they actually take an issue or a piece of research that they're really passionate about and then pursue it, and then they have to write it up and present it to the colleagues and see how your operations will change. And she got very excited about that. And she said, yeah, that's great. So we could do that on a Wednesday afternoon and we'll have them all in the same room. And I said, why do you need them all in the same room? She said, because I have to keep an eye on them. And I thought, you're not getting this.
Yeah.
You can't kind of hold on to those reins and say that you're losing control. So it goes back to Daniel Pink's stuff about autonomy and drive and what makes people tick. And it just seems to me to be a non-negotiable now that we cannot have that type of CEO who is you can't, even if you wanted to, you can't know everyone's job anymore anyway. The world's far too complex for that.
No, I totally agree. And it's funny because that leads me, what you would talk later in the book about sort of if you want to sort of enable and make sort of people-led innovation possible, you talk about 8 key principles. You talk about trust and transparency, engagement and equity, autonomy and agency, and mastery and meaning. They're all brilliant, but I really want to talk about trust most of all, because to me, trust is the single most important building block to get all this right. And we see it in spades in a world of dispersed working, and back to that sort of empowerment style of leadership rather than micromanaging. What can leaders do to sort of grow, and not even just leaders, what can leaders and individuals do to grow and engender trust in the organization?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that, because I agree with you. I think the other 7 don't really feature unless you've got that in place. And it is so hard. There is a knowing doing gap, it seems to me, with leaders about trust. They know, and because umpteen surveys have been done, they know that it is absolutely critical to the success of an organization. But they somehow can't bring themselves to do it. And when I was writing that section, I looked at a number of things, and I've also got a copy of the book with some bookmarks in it. And I cited 2 studies on this. One's by a guy called Paul Browning, and the other's Stephen Covey. And it was interesting to see the overlap in them. But it's things like, being able to admit mistakes. You have to give trust in order to get it. And I think people don't, they fundamentally have difficulty with that notion that, trust can't really be earned. It has to be given. And so you have to be in that position where you're giving trust to other people, and in return, they'll start to trust you.
Sorry, just on that, because I like that, because you specifically talked about the importance of vulnerability in a leader, yeah, which I think speaks exactly to that point, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And, I think we're starting to see some examples of that now, particularly in the kind of knowledge sector, where people are admitting that they've got it wrong, or that they're really worried. And it's not that long ago that you couldn't really do that and keep your job as a leader.
Yeah, no, totally. Okay, I want to sort of, I guess, go to home territory for you, really, which is education and learning. And I guess I want to close later on, thinking about schools and universities. But right now, let's stay in the organisation and let's stay with sort of leaders. And it's funny because this has been something that comes up time and time in our conversations on this show, which is about the difference between skills and traits. So in a modern digital society, what becomes more important are these sort of core human principles, rather than the fact that I can code, in COBOL, or I know how to operate a certain kind of machinery. And in the book, you call out this as a difference between mindset and skill set. And I wondered if that was the same thing, or if one of you were going somewhere else with that.
No, I think it is the same thing. I think the phrase I use in the book is mindset will always beat skill set, because there just seem to be a number of examples of people who had done amazing things. One of the people I cited in the book is a woman called Andrea Coleman, who set up an organization called Riders for Health, an NGO in Africa. And it's ensuring that people in remote parts of Africa can get access to healthcare. and it happens to do it by motorcycle couriers, either they're couriering test samples, or they're bringing medics out to remote villages. It just so happened that Andrea was a motorcycle fanatic all her life. When she was 19, she was racing motorcycles. She's 70 now and still doing it. And so I think if Andrea had been, a chemist, she would have been working on vaccines for Africa. So I think the skill set can be built around the available mindset that you've got. But without that mindset, you're going to be struggling. And we've seen lots of organizations who've put together what they thought was, a team of complementary talents, to find that they don't share the same mindset. And I think, given the rise in the spending power of millennials, that's really important that you get the mindset right, because now millennials want to know, what do you stand for, before they will buy your product or come and work for you.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think within that, there's this, it's almost becoming a cliche now, which it shouldn't, because it's crucial to this, is this concept of lifelong learning. But I don't know about you, and probably you more than me, because you've been in this bloody world. I feel like we've been talking about lifelong learning for ages, but doing bugger all about it. Do you know what I mean? And especially when it comes to organisations. So what do we need to do to make lifelong learning, everybody's expectation of how it works?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, when did I first hear that phrase? It's probably around the mid 1980s, and yet we still haven't structured it. And at that point, I was working in further education, and we thought, hurrah! People are talking about lifelong learning. That's our clientele, and yet there was no support. The focus has always been upon, well, obviously schools, but universities. And I think people like Tony Blair didn't help when he said we want 50% of people to get to university. And you think, well, why? What's so great about that university experience? Of course, what we're seeing now is that disruption, which is happening all over the world, is also happening in the higher education sector. So universities are being challenged like never before. And they are having to think about the need to develop lifelong learning. But I have to say, Dave, frankly, in this country, they're not really getting that leadership from the government. What was interesting when I was looking at case study organizations was I went out to Dubai, and they've now completely rethought their education and training philosophy, so that they have a series of entitlements. If you're a young person, why should you be stuck in one school? Why couldn't you choose to do arts in one school and science in another? But also, why couldn't you get your hobbies recognized? If you were really good at athletics, then you should have time in order to do that. But crucially, what they also say is we need a different kind of micro-credentialing, which understands that you're going to, in your life, you're not going to stop at 21. You're not going to be done with education. You're going to keep having to learn and relearn and unlearn. And therefore, they've made this commitment to lifelong learning genuinely, and much more flexible forms of assessment and accreditation. Because it seems to me one of the issues around lifelong learning is, if we've got a structure which we still have, which is clunky and out of date, it has to be validated by organizations. And I worked alongside a university, and I tried to get a program through, and they said, we want to know what you're going to be doing in 5 years' time. I said, I work in the performing arts industry. We don't know what we're going to be doing in 5 months' time.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So we've got to get much better at how we accredit it. Although, frankly, I think the tech and the knowledge sector is driving this anyway, because you've got more and more people like Google who are saying, not interested in what you know. Show us what you can do with what you know. And that applies whether you're 50 or 60. I think the only point I would make about Google, since I've always been a Google fan, in fact, I had shares until quite recently, is they don't look at diversity sufficiently well within their organization. So the vast majority, and you could tell me if this was the case at Microsoft, the vast majority of people, I visited Google's headquarters in Sydney, and I didn't see anybody who was either younger than 30 or older than 45. And I think that's a shame, because we're now starting to see, on one end of that, we're seeing this concept of kind of reverse mentorship. What can we learn from young millennials coming into the company? But one of the organizations that I cite is called Sparks and Honey, and they've set up this, what they call experienced internships for people who've possibly even retired, but they've got this wealth of experience.
Yeah.
They want to bring that back within the organization.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's not really a reflection of Microsoft or Google. I think it's a reflection of the industry. And I think my industry faces a massive diversity challenge. The majority of people in all tech companies, as far as I'm aware and in my experience, are white, middle-aged men, and actually increasingly less middle-aged, more young men. And whilst that's great, it doesn't make for great products. We've seen problems in things like algorithmic bias playing out. We had it here in the UK recently with the border forces passport verification algorithm, which was terrible if you're a female and a woman of color. Just, it just shouldn't be in that world. Equally, I think the age thing is crucial, and I don't think we pay enough credence to this. There's too much of the sort of, I think, of chasing the sort of the malleability of youth, let's call it that, which is people who are prepared to be told what to do. Their innovation is a bit like at school. It's kind of a little bit crushed out of them. Just do the job in front of you. When actually I do see around me, and you see it in spades now, right, in terms of the pandemic and what's happening in the labour market, lots and lots of older generation people who are being made redundant are walking away with an incredible amount of skills and experience that I think companies lose, is a massive loss for them to be sort of away from that. So one of the things I'd love us to see as a society, and certainly, for my part in our industry, is how we bridge some of those gaps, because that diversity becomes crucial to it. But I also think, it plays into where we started this conversation was around lifelong learning, because, we look at, this is a bit I don't understand, and let me get very parochial just for a minute. It's a very UK oriented. Time and time again, we see like a government report, and it might be from the Office of National Statistics, it might be from DWP, talking about, the fact that in 2030, 80% of the current workforce will still be in the workforce, only they won't have any of the skills required to be in the workforce, if you know what I mean. And then we sort of talk about things like digital divide and all that sort of stuff. At one point do we realise that actually, surely for me, the point of any society is to ensure that all individuals can both offer value and be valued by the society in which they inhabit. That has to be, our goal in all of this. And I think, it's interesting that you call out the Dubai example, because I think part of the challenge I see here in the UK specifically, and again, very parochially, is there is a level of snobbery, a culture, if you like, that it's changing slowly. I mean, look at the change in the perspective on apprenticeships that's happened over the last probably 5 years, maybe slightly longer. But before, an apprenticeship was the thing that you did if you couldn't get into university or you couldn't get into FE. So you went and did an apprenticeship, and it was, it was all right, but frankly, what a shame for you. When in reality, it should be an amazing opportunity. I know too many organizations who still to this day list, a degree as a sort of a gateway qualification to get into their interview panel. And I just think, is that really relevant in today's age? So a very long-winded way of me asking the question, do you think that it's another big cultural change that we have to make in order to be able to bridge this gap, to be able to rethink our approach to skills and the kind of way in which we acquire those skills as a society?
Well, I think once again, this pandemic has forced this disruption and has forced us to rethink. I mean, don't get me wrong, the furlough scheme was a brilliant idea to just to enable people to retain some dignity and to keep businesses going. But effectively, what we're doing is paying people to do nothing. And it seems to me that coming out of COVID, we are going to have fractured communities, places where the life has been sucked out of those communities. And we need to be paying the young people, perhaps, who can't find the jobs because they're the ones who are suffering disproportionately as a result of that. We need to be able to pay those people to help to restore a sense of community, because if we don't, I fear for what our communities are going to look like, particularly our inner city communities.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's the big, in a sense, I think that has been a problem for a long time, and the pandemic has just made it more obvious. But it is this connection, and there's two sides for me. One is digital skills, and just let me grandstand or stand on a soapbox just for a minute, David. But we whenever we talk about digital skills, we always end up talking about coding for kids. And I'm sorry, coding for kids might be a digital skill, but actually it's a digital skill for computer programmers. And typically, if you're going to be a computer programmer, you're already going to be interested in coding. What we need to do is we need to be getting to every young person and equipping them with the basic digital skills that give them confidence to make whatever they choose to do better. That's the heart of this matter for me. And while we're at it, we need to make the digital divide not exist. It's a bit like lifelong learning for me, David, is we always like, yeah, but what about the digital divide? Yeah, that's going to stop us doing that. Well, yes, it is, unless we bloody fix it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And it's just, we can't keep pointing to the problem and then doing nothing. And if anything, COVID has just accentuated the need for us to, look at what's happened to the school kids of this nation, and in the US as well, specifically, this is happening. When, forced to remote learn, there's a proportion of kids who are absolutely fine because they've got a device to themselves or probably a big gaming rig. And then there's the families that are essentially sharing a single phone between 3 kids in order to be able to engage with school. We can't let that happen. And then bemoan the fact that it's there. These things have got to be part of the building blocks of what we do.
And I can hear the passion in your voice on this, and I share that passion, because actually what's now going on, it's not being reported because of just the welter of news, but is that the government's reneging on its promise to give schools in deprived areas laptops. So I know one school just down the road from here, Parklands, who were promised 120 laptops. They're in the most deprived part of Leeds. They got an email on the Friday before half term was due to start to say, oh, by the way, we're just giving you 16 now. We've had to save some money. And you think, how much money are you going to save? We've found billions and billions during this pandemic. Let's give some of it we could end this digital divide tomorrow. It wouldn't cost us a fraction of what it's currently costing us.
Well, and that's the thing that really hacks me off, because, again, it's a bit like the digital skills thing. You look time and time again in all of the reports, and they're, done independently as well as by people from the industry, but they all show roughly the same thing, that for every £1 we spend on digital skills and solving the digital divide, the economy gets back about 10 quid in terms of, better economy, better health outcomes, all this sort of stuff. We know this is the bloody answer, and yet still we want to talk about stuffing a bloody train from London to Birmingham 15 minutes quicker. When do you know what I mean? We're stuck in this Victorian mentality when actually we need some very 21st century people led innovation in order to make that happen. See what I did there?
Yeah, I do.
You can tell I'm a professional.
It made me think of the Repowering organisation in London, who are just doing a remarkable thing. They're a cooperative, not for profit, but they are going around deprived council house estates and these big blocks of flats, and it's a beautiful example of circular benefits. They're training young people, mostly Afro-Caribbean kids, who have dropped out of school, and they're training them in solar panel construction and how solar panels are put together. They then put them up on the roof. They do a community fundraise, and they're becoming self-sufficient in their own energy. But what was fascinating about that particular example was that the communities themselves said, but we're now producing surplus energy, and we don't want to give it back to the grid. We want to give it to our cousin who lives in the estate over there. Why can't we do that? And they said, well, because we can't. And they said, well, why not? Get some people in and let's work on it. And they've now come up with the world's first blockchain technology peer-to-peer energy lending service. And it's still just being trialed at this point. but the level of innovation that's been driven by those people in the community, and we're just ignoring all of that energy and potential, as you say, for the sake of a few quid, repowering or constantly living from hand to mouth, and yet they're generating real worth in the community. It's crazy. We've got it all around back to front.
No, exactly. And I mean, it's a bit like we were talking earlier about sort of established organizations choosing to ignore the innovation that's out there. But I think, and again, it's the point that you make in the book about the sort of the level of user-led innovation that's coming, and people aren't going to sit around and wait anymore, which I think is going to be so powerful in terms of bringing that through and making it happen. So let's sort of just flip back to learning and switch gears slightly. Early on in the book, you talk about the last mile problem, which will bring us into sort of conversation about skills and education. And the last mile problem is really that, it's really easy to do a lot of the work that we do. I think sending a package was your example, and it was something like 30% of the effort to deliver a package from A to B is in the last mile of the journey. But for me, what really resonated was how much the last mile of any journey, and I'm using that in a loose sense, highlights the human skills that are required. And so for me, it's the things that we're not going to be able to easily automate. And is that really, do you think like that last mile problem is probably the best place for us to look when we're trying to identify what the skills requirements are for the future? What are the skills that, my son's going to need to be successful and his kids are going to need to be successful? Is that the best place for us to start to look?
Yeah, because machines, generally speaking, are lousy at being human, and we've got to recognize that they're brilliant at most of the other things. And we've got an education system which has effectively been preparing people to think like machines, to be able to do calculations, to be able to regurgitate information, to be able to store it and retrieve it. Machines can do that so much better, but what they can't do is the kind of empathy skills, the kind of human skills, and they will never be able to do that. So that's what we should be focusing on. The example I think I used in the book was in Japan, where the use of robotics is just outstripping every other country. They're using these personal buddies in old age homes to give senior citizens a little bit of company, when this used to be a society where young people would revere their old people and make sure that they got the kind of attention and company that they deserved. But they can't do that anymore because they're having to do 3 jobs. And therefore they've got no time to go and visit the grandmother. So we solve it by putting this robot in. It seems to me we've what's wrong with this picture? We've got a chance now, as a result of this pandemic, I think, to fundamentally reappraise where we want to go as a society and as a planet. And I'm not saying everything will change. No doubt some things will go back. But if we don't use this as an opportunity to rethink, then I'm not sure when we'll get another chance to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I couldn't, this is exactly the same conclusion that we've all reached in this conversation. And I started doing this, 2 weeks into pandemic, because I was fearful. And even though I felt the pandemic might end a bit earlier than it actually will do, fearful that we would just, we'll do a whole bunch of stuff now just to get by, a whole bunch of compromises. And then once the pandemic's finished, we'll go back to educating, one teacher, 30 kids in a classroom, and we'll all go back into the office and we'll have those horrible commutes and life, and it was like, Jesus, we can't afford to do that. We can't afford to go back. So I'm hopeful that the best thing to come from this terrible experience will be a catalyst. I sort of the pessimist in me sort of sees the light at the end of the tunnel, but actually the optimist now realizes that I don't think that it's an oncoming train anymore. I think if we can get through this, we're actually going to emerge into the 21st century. So that lights our gateway into the 21st century.
I agree. And sorry, Dave, just to add to that, I think the some of that driver, this isn't going to come from our political leaders. I think some of that driver is going to come from us as individuals and as businesses and as CEOs. We have to be much more vocal now. And what struck me about those 8 characteristics that we talked about before, trust, transparency, all those, is that they've been absent in our society progressively over the last 20 years or so. And it seems to me now that alongside that, we have more mass movements which have taken place in the last 10 years than we have in the previous 200. And they're being successful. If you think about how chaotic Occupy was, we had Black Lives Matter 20 years ago, but it wasn't achieving anything like the kind of success that it is now. And that to me speaks to the fact that we're learning from those mistakes, we're better organized, we're so much better networked, and we're savvy now in ways that we weren't, even 30 years ago. So I think that drive for social action is only going to increase. And for me, spending a lot of time around young people, it's thrilling to see that they are at the vanguard of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And do you think that's the opportunity then? And so as an organization and as a leader, coming to the end of the book, is the right action, the best action, to be an active and vocal part in wanting to make that happen, empowering those people to be, autonomous, to have agency, to master the things that they do, and to be, to create an environment where that becomes possible. Do you think that's the legacy, if you like, of the book?
I think it's the only option. When you think about the wealth inequality gap that we've currently got, that's not sustainable. We can build those gated communities, but at some point, people are going to climb over those fences. If we allow this to continue, then so even in our own self-interest, it would make sense to actually work with those young people to help them, just to give them a little nudge. I'm doing a talk next week, and I came across this young 15-year-old, and I meet these people regularly. She's in a school in Bogota, in Colombia. She's invented this amazing. It's a kind of igloo, but it's obviously made out of lightweight plastic material, and it's easily transportable. It sleeps 2 or 3 people with a little kitchen. The whole thing can just fold up, and it's for when there are natural disasters and people have lost their home. She's done all that as a school project, and she's taken it to the United Nations. And I said, well, you're going to come on this talk with me, and we're going to find you some philanthropists who will put some money into this, because this is what we have to do, is to say to these young people, tell us your ideas and help us fix the world. Because the challenges that are coming down the pipe in 20 or 30 years, I'm not going to be around, but these young people are going to have to fix climate change. They're going to have to find a solution to mass migration, and it goes on. So unless we nurture their skills and talents and give them the autonomy to be able to fix these wicked problems, then I'm not sure that we have a future.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, and I would go, I was going to say I could go further, but I think you're on the same page as me. I think it's our duty of care. I think, our generation, people of our age, we are the guardians of the future that our kids are going to inherit. And if we give them, we're already handing them this steaming pile of, climate change and economic disparity. And if we also, as part of that package, choose not to give them the skills that they're going to need to solve those problems, I think we're derelict in our duty. And so that has to be for me, and that's why I love the book, because not only do you lay this stuff out, you also give us some pretty clear guidance as organizational leaders, as organizations, and as individuals, for everything that we can do to make that future that positive future happen, such that our kids are equipped with the right skills and the right kind of ambition and the right kind of moral and philosophical guidance to deliver the world that we all need.
Absolutely.
That's wonderful. Well, I had a good teacher actually in this, so that was very, very good. So listen, David, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with us and taking us through the book. It's a really, really fantastic read, and I'll certainly write some more about it, and I'll be posting this on the interview. So thanks so much for joining us, David.
Thank you, Dave. Take care.
So thanks, everybody. That's it pretty much for this week. It's been a fantastic conversation. I really recommend, I think The Power of Us is, as I called it out, I think it's a great handbook, a guidebook, if you will, that will help you and your organization navigate through the chaos that lies ahead. That's pretty much it for this week. We'll be back next week. We'd love to see you all again. Thanks so much for joining. If you've enjoyed the conversation, as always, we would love to get your subscription, your like. If you haven't enjoyed the conversation, then let us know. Don't let us do this in silence. We'd love to talk to you. We'd love to hear more from you. Thanks so much, and we will see you all again next week.
There are 1,000 stories in the Envisioners' future. This is just one of them.